Or okay. Right, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, don't worry.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our workshops today. So our topic today is talking about the Geovisualizations 101, which is the very the start levels. Some contents about how to make your first web maps, and I think that's I would say. I wish when I was learning with web maps, I really appreciate if someone can teach me about this, and I don't have to go through all the things by myself. So I'm going to teach you the very essence of what is a web maps, what is a web page in the first place, and we're going to talk actually in more advanced versions later, right? So about me, I think Vashini already talked a lot about me, and my name is Louis Liu, and you can call me Louis. If you have any questions, please address me as Louis. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor, so that's right. All right. So let me go into that. So before we actually go into the contents, we want to talk about this learning objectives. So by the end of this workshops, you should be able to explain the structure of a web pages, because we always want to start from the very beginnings, right? We actually spend most of our time talking about the very basic of web pages. So yes, so a lot of you may seems like, okay, this is so easy, right? But no, actually, even if you know a lot about web pages, probably you'll get more like a knowledge later, right? So right, and also we hope you to be able to report HTML, JavaScript, and the CSS usages and the simple grammars after these workshops, but you are not actually required to write these standalone apps by yourself. That's not required. That's not within our scope. So that's all right. And finally, we want to share single web maps with GitHub pages. I will share some examples by myself, how to do that, what is the environment looks like. So go ahead. And before that, you want to go to this website so that you can actually find out all the materials I'm using right now. So if you want to follow me, that's all right, but you are not actually expected to follow me. So because we're recording this, you can always go back. I will upload these videos later that you can always revisit it later. Okay, right. I think I should share this link in the chat so that everybody can see that. Yeah, I think that's a better idea. All right, there we go. Okay, so let's go back and there it is. Okay, so first, why should we use web maps, right? I always ask this question, in the sequence of why, what, and how, right? So before asking how, asking what, we need to ask why we do this, right? If it is really no point of doing this, why should we do that, right? This is a very a very give me this sense of the facilities this kind of vibes. But anyway, so why we should be using the web maps, right? The first one is this is very accessible, right? I'm talking about accessible in terms of two perspectives. The first one is economics, right? I don't know about you. You may be a rich, super rich kid, but I'm not. I'm a super broke. So I always want to consider what is what is the price of that, right? So that is very valid consideration, especially when you employ in the small companies where you want to start up your own company, is that you want to consider what's your price for your tools, right? And this is not just for you as developers, this is also for the users, which is the future user you're going to deliver your product to, right? And there is really no hidden fee, so you don't have to worry about something like this, $800 a year, which is ridiculous, right? And also, besides economic, I'm also talking about accessibilities in terms low dependencies, which means when you want to use that, you don't have to install thousands of different softwares to use that alone, right? You just have to get access to the internet and a web browser, and that is honestly not very strict requirements per se. So so when you have the web maps, the only you need is like an internet and a web browser. That's all. And also, web map is kind of robust, right? If you're not into the GIS softwares, or if you're into the traditionals like desktops, like I won't call out the names because I don't want to get in trouble. But this is very practically like you will see this every day, which means it will crash a lot, right? So, but for web maps, it does not have that issue particularly somehow. Is that you just see everything inside the web browser. What's the worst scenarios, right? You just refresh that and it's just back on again, right? And in that sense, it's kind of like give you a better sense of a robustness. So in that sense, is very reliable in some way. And also, it has a very low risk of failings, which means as long as the server is running, as long as your power is on, your internet is on, you can still use that, right? And the third perspective is the compatibilities, right? I know that maybe everyone is using different platforms right now. It's like a Windows, iOS, Linux, but the best point of a webmaps must be that in different platforms, as long as you have a web browser installed, you can use that. There is no like, I think it is definitely a good news for Linux or iOS user is that a lot of times Windows is having this hegemony that it just have just like a one version of Windows version, which means that iOS and Linux for user, if they want to use that, they have to like install some kind of like emulators or something, right? So that is a very bad in some sense. And also, I know that touching screen is very popular, like especially among the Gen Z. So a lot of like students are growing up with touching screens, right? So we can actually use that right now. So use that as in the web maps, and that is very fantastic thing to have, right? So that's basically, this is like we have so many reasons that we can see, okay, this is enough for us to actually start to use the web maps. So we're going to talk about some basics stuff of a web page. I know you are like expert of using internet. I know that, but have you ever wondering how it works, right? Maybe you work, maybe you like already studied a lot about that, but just follow me. I think you will have the better understanding of this. Okay, the first part we're going to talk about is HTMLs, right? Before we talk about this, I want to talk about this web page in general, right? So web page is especially like essentially like a contents in the web browser. So this is like a very trivial, isn't it? But think about this, how does the web page consist of, right? A typical web browser consists of three parts, which is HTMLs, JavaScript, and CSS. We can use analogies to like to describe each part of these web maps, right? For HTMLs, it seems like your human's face, right? As a human face, it stands for your bones, right? For example, like my shapes of my face looks like this mostly because I have these bones as underneath my skins, right? So HTML is literally the foundation of the whole like web maps or web pages. So that's why also when you want to like save web pages into a local machines, you will figure out, okay, I actually have to open the HTML files to open up to see the saved web pages, right? And also besides, we'll also use a JavaScript. It is like the muscle and senses, right? I use the two parts to describe JavaScript is that it can move. In that sense, it's kind of like our muscles, right? And also it can react, which means it has a senses that it can detect some certain behavior and the phenomenon so that it can react based on what is observed, right? That is a very, very nice things to have if we want to achieve like interactivities, right? So JavaScript is like the muscle and senses. So, but finally, CSS is like a makeups, right? It's like making the layouts, making the color fonts, and the CSS is actually surprisingly important, right? We'll talk about this later. So first, we want to talk about is HTML. Is I talked a lot about is it is actually like your bones, right? So HTML's full name is a hypertext markup language. So that's why it is called HTML. I do not like these long names, so I want to break it up, okay? So let me open my pen so that we can try something, okay? So first we have hyper. Hyper is, yeah, it is fancy, right? It's just a hyper, but we can cross that out. So text, which means that it's basically a text, right? Just like a word, like a rich text file. That's why we say it's a rich text file with some media around us, like YouTube's, right? You have some like videos playing, right? And finally, it is a markup language. Basically means it's just like a Word documents, but really in codes, right? So it will look like this. If you just store it locally and open up with your notepad or notebook, you actually like see this, something like this. So one thing that happening inside your web browser is that it will translate this code into something like this. So this is actually what we see on like by our naked eyes, right? But in the back, in the background, so you actually like this is what happens, right? So that's why HTML, again, it is foundation of web pages. And okay, let me see the chat. Do we have any questions? I cannot see the chat though. Okay. Okay, so yeah, I think I will go back to the questions later. So let's finish the yeah. Okay, so HTML we talk about, it has a lot of like the contents on the pages, right? So if we break it down, again, I like to break it down because it's easier to understand. But HTML elements, and it consists of different elements and the text, right? So a web page consists of different elements, just like when you want to build something, so you have like segments and there's different like breaks, right? That's why we like break it up, right? So each element is indicated by a pair of text represent its types. For example, like buttons. This is actually, this is pretty much a web page actually. So the only difference between a very complicated ones is that it just have one button. That's all, and doesn't do anything already. So, but it is ready by its long is actually a web page. So what is in the backend looks like? So no, it was the background looks like, and the source code looks like. This is what it looks like in the HTML format. You will see that they have a 3 parts, or you can code the 2 parts, right? So we have tag 1 and the tag 2. It is the 2 pairs of tags, and the center it is some tags that's a clean meat, right? That's why we see the clean meat. So the tags show it is indeed buttons, right? So these words inside this bracket is represent its types, right? For example, if it is a button, it is buttons, right? If it is something else, it can have something else. We have A, B, P, divs. We can see here is we have a lot of these things happening here, which means not just the only buttons, right? You don't actually have to understand this, just want to give you a sense of what HTML looks like, right? A lot of times, this HTML can include all our elements inside, just like onions, right? So that's why I show you different layers, right? You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, right? These are 6 layers, like layer after layers, you can actually achieve either higher performance or better like better layouts, or it's just something that's just requires you to do this in this way, and that's like necessary, right? And as you can see, this is actually like here's we have the buttons, right? But you can see a lot of other information. We'll talk about this again. And the inner side, they have this one is actually icon. So there's very common if you want to add icon into the buttons, right? For example, like a Twitter, like you will see like these are sent icons in the sent buttons, right? That's pretty common. So let's break it down, okay? I like to go deeper into these tags, right? Because we just show a very simple example of what it looks like, right? So I will show a link. So this is essentially another web page. Again, this is very like, although it is very simple, it doesn't do anything alone, but it is by itself a web page, right? So in the HTML format, this web page looks like this, right? So let's break it down again. So first it is A, right? So just like a buttons bracket with a bracket, it is A. So A usually represent the links, right? But it depends, right? So A is represent a text name, which is like represent what you are, what these elements is essentially is, right? And we have different attributes, right? So if you know like a GIS or shapefiles, you know like what is a records in shapefiles. That's all right. If you don't, that's all right. So a tag also have attributes, right? These attributes represent different features about these elements, right? For example, like we have the most three, I would say three typical attributes here, which is ID, class, and href. So ID is a name for these specific elements. So for example, like here's in the last ones, what kind of name that is? Is this a clean means? No, probably not. It's just the text on it. We can name anything, right? So that's why we want to add something like add the names, just like your name, my names, right? And what we want to add something to that to represent, what your name is at, so that we can actually select these specific elements later, right? For example, like so I write these down, but later I want to like find out, okay, I have this link like written here, right? So I want to do something about maybe some changes some colors, maybe add some behavior, maybe add another link to these links, right? That happens a lot, right? So ID serve as like an anchor to find out what is you are, where you are, right? And that is very useful, right? And ID is like your unique name. So for example, my name is Louis Liu. So if you want to find me, just to find like ID equals Louis Liu, right? But however, sometimes we want to find a lot of people's, right? For example, I want to find all the graduate students, right? So for me, if I was an element, I would just be tagged with a class name, which is a graduate students, right? So here's we use a class names for a group of elements so that we can select or apply changes on many elements. That's very useful because we cannot sometimes possibly name every elements in the web page because we have so many of them. Sometimes we just cluster them and apply changes all together. So that is very common and that is very efficient, right? And finally, we have a href. This is, I don't know how to pronounce it, honestly, but I would just call it href. It is represent the hyperlink attached to these elements, right? For example, you want to like attach a link to this link with like google.com, right? You can just say google.com here, so that once you click this link, it will take you to the google.com, right? That's very useful, right? And that's very, very common. And remember, there is many other attributes for different uses. I just show three of them, which is the most common ones. So, so yeah. So we spend a lot of times talking about this, right? So HTML alone, however, is not enough, right? If you like me as the older internet users, you will remember before the 2005, everything is without the JavaScript, right? Everything is so static. It's very hard to interact. There is basically no animations. However, they do have animations, right? Remember the Adobe Flash, right? That is a thing before, right? I think they stopped that services like 2 years ago. But anyway, that's off the topic right now. But HTML alone, as you can see, it is very static, right? And also it is very ugly. Right? We can already see that, and I can see that in two perspectives. The one is that is like, it's just like visually ugly, right? That's a good enough reason to like stay away from HTMLs. And also, it is very hard to read, write, and maintain, right? Now remember this. Imagine you have to deal with this like all day long. So that's kind of miserable, isn't it? So so that's why we want to stay away from writing raw HTML alone. But however, we want to add another programming languages, which HTML is not, to write HTML for us. And that is much more efficient. And finally, the HTML is not a programming language. Remember, what is HTML? It's the hypertext markup language. It is a markup language, which means it don't actually do something itself. It just show itself, right? So that's why we need to introduce a programming languages to better, like achieve better interactivities, or to help us to maintain, read, write, and do some things more efficiently. That's very confident and very good to have. Right. And before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of HTML. So HTML have just like our bodies, right? They have a head and the bodies, right? The head just like every information you stores, right? And head parts include metadata, which basically like your names, your description of these web page, some theme colors, for example, like if you open up the web page, it will usually show as a theme color, either white or black or something else, right? It depends on, sometimes it depends on your systems like themes, right? And also it can include the necessary libraries, for example, like a JS and CSS library discussed later. In that sense, you can actually cite another person's work, or you can use another people's work so that you don't have to like start all over again or write everything by yourself. That is very good to have. And also you can include your other files, for example, your data files. That's a possible way to do that, but we don't actually do that in the productions process. Anyway, so head parts don't actually include anything you see on the screen, but include many useful informations. But for body parts include actual HTML elements you see on the screen. So everything you see on the screens in the web page is actually inside the web body parts. We'll actually talk about this a little bit about this later, right? And also remember the body parts the head parts can usually be reused, which means you can actually, like if you have two similar projects by yourself, or you can actually have the privilege or permissions to copy from others ones, you can actually directly copy that. And that's very convenient. You don't have to like write this like from scratch. That's very good to have. Right, so we talk about that HTML is not like enough, right? So JavaScript is a programming language. It's just like our muscles and senses, right? So JavaScript is a programming language to support and manipulate HTMLs. So here's I use the muscles, which is corresponding to actions. Basically, in the programming like jargons, we can call them the functions, right? It can change contents. Basically, it can do some things, right? It can change the color, it can change the contents, it can like do some things inside the functions, right? Or it can use a census, where census is something like events, right? In the programming jargons. So events can do reactions. Basically, I can detect and detect some things, detect some changes. For example, like if you click on the screens or click on certain buttons, I can ask the web pages to do some things, right? And that's why we call the reactions to a change or input, right? For example, like a background changes after click buttons, right? As very common behaviors inside of web pages, right? And finally, remember that JavaScript is not Java, just like Ham is not hamsters, right? The JavaScript and the Java is two different languages. Do not like claim in your CV that after these like workshops, you know Javas, right? You can, of course, you can claim you know JavaScript like a little, right? But do not claim you know Java because they are two different things, right? And that's a pretty common mistake that a lot of people make. So do not make that mistake again, right? All right, so we want to talk just a little bit about the basic grammar. This is the part I hate most because it really is like just to talk about some grammars, right? But it is necessary, right? We need to like understand at least to give you some sense of how this like a JS clause and what it means by JS, like a different like notations, right? All right, so if you know Python or R, this is the part you can skip or you can zoom out, okay? So it's pretty much the same. But JS have a very similar grammar just because they are essentially like a scripting languages, right? So first we need to, before we use anything, we need to declare our variables. For example, like a var, let. So these things are like, if you know C++ or C, this is like the same things, right? You need to declare before use, right? And if is like condition clause, right? So if is, for example, like here's we have the example. So you declare inputs, right? But however, if your input is not defined, you can do some things, right? Or you can do something else. This is essentially like the 90% of the artist, like AI is working, right? If you think about how AI is working, like a chat box, right? You want to design the chat box, for example, like you tell to the chat box that how are you, right? The chat box usually is consists of a lot of like conditional clause, which is ifs, right? If the user says, how are you, then they will like do this, which is sometimes it's just to say something, right? For example, like I'm fine, thank you, and you, right? That's pretty much like these a lot of like basic reactions that we can achieve inside these environments, right? And it's definitely good to have. And then we talk about the functions in the last page, right? Here's we talk about function that we can actually do some things, right? So this part we can actually define functions by functions false, right? This is the name of this function. You can change anything, right? And then after declare that, or before you declare that, you can directly execute the functions. So this is actually a very interesting part, is that you can actually use it before declaring it. Look at here, right? And finally, notice that everywhere is a semicolons, right? It is recommended, but not necessary. And that is actually the point I like the most about JS, especially as a newcomers. So is that JS don't actually like be strict. They don't like strict grammars, right? So even if you miss a lot of things, or you miss, for example, like miss these vars, it can still running, right? That's like the best news for you. Okay, if you like don't like the grammar or strict grammar like me, that's right. You can still run that as long as it does not encounter some fatal errors or some like logic errors, right? So yeah, this is pretty good, right? And finally, we have a comments, right? So comments, we have two forms of comments. Basically, you can write some things alongside your, here's you can write some explanations, write some documentation alongside the clause so that you can understand later, right? And that is not trivial at all, because documentation is very important, especially for if you want to write a large project, or it is like even if you're writing by your own, and that is still very important, because you may be forgetting what to write just right now. That actually happens to me, not just because I'm older than you, but yeah, that's actually happens. Even if you are a younger person, that's actually happens. You forget what you write, or you don't understand what you're writing. That's very important. But anyway, so the JS libraries we want to introduce is jQuery, right? So native JS is not enough sometimes, right? So native JS is like the vanilla versions. It does not give you a lot of like freedoms to do some things, and its grammar is kind of like redundant. It has a lot of like a long sentence. That's kind of a puzzles, right? So that's why we use the jQuery, which is a very useful library for starters, especially for starter, but still useful for many cases. Its function starts with a dollar signs, right? Very fancy, very very good, right? And it uses two stops usually. So we talk about how we want to find some things after we define the HTMLs, right? HTML elements, right? So usually the first step involves selecting the objects and then do some things about it, right? This is very pretty smooth logic, right? So basically, for example, like now imagine this, right? You want to borrow books from the libraries, right? The first thing you need to do is that you want to find out the books, right? A second is like borrow it or read it or destroy it, whatever you like, right? Or in other sense, you want to ask it or react to some things, right? So in that sense, you want to like here's right, like borrow the books, right? After you borrow books, you plant the bombs. So after the next people borrow that, they will explode, right? This is another sense of the reactions, right? So so I will give it some examples here. So first, in the jQuery, like these libraries, you will use like two different formats corresponding to the two different kind of like objects. How do we define the names of objects, right? So first, we can select only one object based on the IDs, right? So that's why we use hashtag to represent, okay, I want to find an object based on the IDs, right? So that's why we see here, we use the IDs, right? So if we have the ID, if we have objects whose ID is the IDs, we can just find it and do something about this later, right? And second, we can also find a bunch of objects, basically a class of objects based on their class names, right? So that's why we use a dot here to represent that we want to find objects based on their class names, right? So that's why we use the class, right? And after we select these things, we either one or a lot or either none, because sometimes you don't actually have these names, right, in your HTML files, and you want to do something in the step 2, which is the change the values of input box, so that you use or you call a method in the jQuery to change the text. For example, this is a very typical operations in the jQuery, is that you first select the input, which usually is like a text box, right? Like text box, right? And you change this value to something else. And basically you don't have to like type it by yourselves, right? A lot of times you can just directly change it in the environments, right? Or this is an example of actions, right? And the second, we have the example of reactions. Basically means that we can find out the certain things and add an object event to a button. When the user click it, show a text, right? This is like ask things or asked the programming languages to react to certain behavior of the users, right? Because users' behavior are not predictable, right? But however, we can predict their behavior and then wait for that. So we may not be able to know when the action happens, but we can react to the actions when it happens, right? And also we sometimes we want to make a request, so we cannot store everything in our codes, right? It's not sometimes possible, or sometimes it's against the like security rules that you may not be able to like store everything inside your environments directly. So that's why we need to make a request to get data, right? So sometimes we want to use the like a jQuery's the get functions to get a certain data from. So these functions have two parameters. First one is the URLs, right? Basically, where is your data stores, right? In our case, it's a data source.com, right? And after you get these data, the callback functions will determine what it will do to the data if the data is available. So in our case, it will be, we define the callback functions as the visualized data. So this is another functions, but basically that means that we want to do something about the data, right? So this is how you make a request. And remember that jQuery does not, or JS does not, in general, does not like that proselytizations, because you need to like define what it will do to this data when it's available immediately, right? Like immediately after it's available. So in that sense, do not wait like later to define what you want to do that. This does not work, right? So usually you need to directly tell the programs to do something when this data is available. That's very important thing to remember. All right, so the CSS parts, right? We cover a lot of these. This is definitely overwhelming for many of you. And I understand that, but this time we're going to relax ourselves because CSS is kind of like it sounds trivial, right? No, actually, no. It's actually pretty important, right? So I will give you some example, but we don't actually like go deep into that. I will expand the reason later, right? So first, we have the sidebars basically with just like a jQuery is like a hashtags, right? Remember the hashtag is like is to find the IDs, right? So we want to find object with the ID of a sidebars, right? And then after find these things, we want to change its width to 250 px, right? So px is basically the pixels, right? So you can see CS is changing its layout, like a position and a sequence, or even like the sizes of the objects, right? And also you can change the colors and the fonts, right? Like here's, so this is still like a position, but you can use the dot. Remember that in the jQuery, dot is like class names, right? And at least the complete items is the class name you want to find. And after you find a lot of these objects, or none of these, or one of these, you actually know how many you find. Anyway, after you find them, you want to do something and change the, for example, like change here, padding equals 4px, which means we want to change the padding to 4px, and the margin tops, change the margin tops to 4px, right? This is like the examples, right? But I don't actually want to go deep in that because CSS is very hard, right? Even I cannot claim I know CSS a lot, right? Because CSS seems trivial among the three, but requires more work. So that's why I say, just like a makeup buy from professional, do not try at home. Do not like produce your makeup at home. That's not safe at all, isn't it? So, and also, I would recommend you to try CSS framework and libraries, right? For example, like Bootstraps. This is actually very, very wise, like a lot of people is using this, right? Including Twitters and a lot of like major websites, right? I know that Twitter is not a good example because they sucks, but anyway, it is very great for arranging layout and simple styles. And it is very nice to have this in a very, very easy way to arrange these things. Because if you like write the CSS by yourself, you know that arranging the sequence and layout is such a hustle and don't want to do that by yourself. So that's why we resort to bootstraps, which is a very common method to do this, right? And also we have the font awesome. So this library provide you some vector icons and the logos. So these are kind of like a very like a very free, and pretty much like all of these are free, like except some like special ones. But anyway, it is very nice to have when you want to like add some little logos, which actually happens a lot, right? So font awesome is very good to have. All right, so we basically cover all of these each three of them. So the HTML, like I said, is the bones, right? It's a foundation of web page. So remember that when you want to, whenever you want to open up like a web page in the local machines, you always want to go to the HTMLs, right? Because that's the files you essentially are looking at, right? And JS is like the muscle and senses, right? You want to like do something or access something to do react to something, right? This is like actions and reactions. And the CSS is the makeup, is like determine your layout and styles and positions and the sizes. And that is, so these three are like having different functionalities, with each of them are very important. So as we talk, HTML again is a foundation of the threes, right? So we need to actually include JS and the CSS files and libraries to the main HTML to make them work, right? So for JS, you need to like include these clause into your like the HTMLs, right? So notice that the names of JS is main.js. So if you have a different position or have a different like if like even you have like a files inside another folders, you can use this, right? You can change these parameters to go to your actual locations, right? And for CSS and CSS, you can change different things. This is also pretty much the same, I would say, except the the specific words, right? But pretty much the same, like these two parameters, right? And finally, to make sure that you add your main JS and the CSS after all the other libraries, not to fail the dependencies, right? It's just like you want to cite something you don't actually already added to your libraries, right? That's this seems trivial, but no, this is actually like very, very common like mistakes for newcomers. So yes. All right, so we'll talk the basics of the web browsers, okay? So we want, no, the web pages. Now we want to talk about this web browser. I know a lot of you already know this. This is like the common senses, but no, it actually is more than you can imagine, right? So first, it is a software that translates the online HTML, JS, CSS code into contents, right? So apart from everything you already know, it's like watching YouTube's or other like websites, there is one particular place you can go to as a developer, which will be very helpful use. It's a debug windows, right? So press F12 or right click and go to inspect. You can go to this page, right? So it will usually looks like this, right? So in here, this is the inspectors. It shows the elements in the current HTMLs, right? Basically, as we say, the foundation of a web page is HTMLs, right? I cannot emphasize that enough, right? And yeah, by the way, I'm using Firefox. Maybe another like a different name for Chrome's or other like softwares, right? And there was a very useful like a little tools that it can actually pick elements on page and show the corresponding HTML codes, right? I can show that very quick. Okay, so let's just go to our official websites, right? If you click on F12, you can see here, I can see the corresponding like HTML codes for each ones, right? Now here's, you can do is you can click on this one and choose the corresponding like elements, right? Like here, if you click on anywhere, you will find out the corresponding codes here, right? And again, what's fantastic about this, it can actually change contents, right? Like blah, 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 right? This is now changed to this. And this is actually a very common like misinformation source, right? You can actually do this by literally anywhere, right? So for example, like Twitters, right? You can actually find out your Twitter and change like someone's tweets like in this way without any like a PS or anything. This is like the most reliable way to do that, but don't do that, okay? We have enough misinformation already. So here's, we can see this is very useful because when you want to like do the web programming, this is very useful to see what's actually happening in the backgrounds, and also to see what is its corresponding like relationships, right? For example, like here's we have a top like the bars over there, right? This is very useful. And notice that as you move around, this is actually changing, right? So that tells you some, a sense of these web pages that in the back end, in the back. Now I keep like saying this, but in the source code that in the JS is actually constantly changing HTMLs. We actually like see here, as you can see, this is changing as we hover into this one. As we click on that, it will change somewhere else. I didn't see that right now, but you know it is changing, right? So let me open that. And also notice that the current HTML may be very different from the ones you wrote your like notepads or the VS Code. Is that because your JS file will constantly add and change the contents just like we see before, right? As you hover into something, it will change the codes, right? So that's why we need to like, don't panic, okay? Especially the first time you open up the F12, well, what is this? Who wrote that? Who changed that? You, okay? You change that. Okay, another one is a web console. So this is like another very useful one here. So it is a JavaScript console for the current page. It's just like if we use R or Python's, it is pretty much the same, right? And also it will have a console.log clause, which means you can actually print some things in the consoles, right? For example, like here I have an example. So in the main.js, in the first lines, I wrote console.log first lines, right? So after we run the web pages in the console page, it will actually show as the first line. So this is very useful. You will like do the programming earlier, it will know that the console will show the information you want to know. And sometimes it's very useful for simple debug. And you can change the current HTML contents by typing commands, right? For example, try this one. I can try this like by myself. Okay, so let's go to the consoles, right? Okay, so we already see a lot of like information here because the Vizathon website is like their programmers are doing a lot of like information here, right? But what we can do is we can just type in this, and there's everything is gone, right? So essentially, this is what this is doing is that we ask the documents to change the body's inner HTML to nothing, right? That's why we see nothing here, right? So now see here, apart from the heads, which is like contains all the metadata and informations, here's the body parts, which is where you see all the information will be gone, right? So it's essentially the mechanism behind this magic, right? All right, so after all long times, almost 45 more minutes, we finally reached the mapping libraries, right? I know this is torturing you maybe. This is so slow, but anyway, we need to understand the basic before we actually go into the map libraries. So the major mapping library we're using for the maps is Leaflet. So Leaflet is a very useful JavaScript library support mapping, right? So remember, it is a JavaScript libraries. So Leaflet, although it does have a CSS components like I see here, it does have a leaflet.css and a leaflet.js, but it, like a lot of times we just say it is a JavaScript libraries, right? And you of course you want to very similar to your main JS or main CSS, you want to use the same logic, same grammars to add these libraries into your HTML so that you can actually use that. And just like the jQuery's $signs, leaflet functions start with else, right? So I will give you an example of how to initialize a leaflet like objects, right? So so first we need to declare a variable called the mymaps, right? This is essentially the like the variable for our leaflet objects, right? So how to do that, right? How to define leaflet maps, right? So we use l.maps, basically that create the map functions, right? So these parameter, only parameter you need is the target HTML elements, which means we will have a div or HTML elements in the main HTML files called map IDs, right? Is ID equals map IDs. And this is pretty much all, right? This is, you can already like call, okay, I have a map already, right? That's why it's fantastic, isn't it? It's very simple. However, besides that, we also want to set the views here after we define these maps, right? So basically we will use a method to set the map to a specific views. For example, like we use two parameters here. The first is the center of our views, right? Basically where we're looking at, right? And a second parameter is the zoom levels, basically how far you want to go in, right? So in the human language translate, I would say basically you can treat it as a series, right? Like or Alexa's, right? So like a leaflet, create the map on the HTML elements called map ID and set that view to the place with these two zoom levels. Basically, you give it here, right? So pretty much like telling these things to do what they want to do, right? And the leaflet have so many functions. And but however, what's good about that is that they actually follow the same logic, which means as long as you know the logic, you can practically like know everything else, right? So all the elements, first, very important is that after you define everything, you need to manually add to my map, which is these things we just define, which is the maps, right? The main maps objects to show on the maps, right? So all the elements must be add to my maps to show on the maps, because now imagine this, even if you don't do anything after the definitions, what do you expect, right? That nothing will happen, right? Even if it is there, you cannot see that. So you need to manually add this. This is very important. And it depends on the things you want to define. There is a lot of things you can play with, right? For example, like the raster layers, vector layers. So these layers, if you know GIS, layer is particularly like a collection of symbologies, right? Like the point or polygons or polylines like combined together on the screens, right? So that's pretty like, we just conceptualize that as a one thing, right? That's called layers, right? And we have other symbols like a single symbols, like a circles, polygons. So these are like a standalone things, right? That's very flexible. I would say more flexible than layers, right? You can just define one and directly add. It's still working, right? And also we have information media is called the pop-up, right? So something like I think that everybody should be having this experience, is that you see a symbology on the maps, you want to click on that to see that something happens, right? So this is something happens usually. It's a pop-up and show what is that thing is, right? So what is the logic, right? We have so many functions, logic. We have so many functions, but they all follow the same logic, which is after you define that, it will have several parameters, right? So the important parameter will list as the direct, like a direct, the important parameter will directly list as a parameter of these functions. For example, here, like here, we define a circles, right? Now, what is like a two what is like the necessary parameters that you want to define a circles, right? You need to define the location of the centroid, right? And second is the radius. So this is like the mass, right? So centroid plus radius define a circles, right? That's why we have two important parameters here, which is 1 and 2, right? So in these functions, we have 1, 2 important parameter, and last we have optional parameters collections. So this is like, it is not necessary, it is optional, but sometimes it is good to have. For example, like the colors. Now here is because we define it as a red, so they will show as red. A few colors, it will be also like slightly red. And opacity is like a kind of like a transparency, right? So these ones are not necessary at all when you want to define a circle, but it is good to have. So that's why we call it optional parameters. It will include in this large object or structure in the bottoms of these functions as another parameters. So no matter how many parameters, optional parameter you have, you will always serve as the major one, like here as a collection in the last place, right? And finally, remember to add to the maps so that the give a circle has shown up. We can actually see this get together later, right? And finally, you can add a pop-up with its contents on the circles, right? So add a pop-up called I am circle. So whenever you click on the circles, you can see that, right? And finally, you want to add the map layers, right? This is like base layers, right? If you don't actually have the base layers, everything will be empty, right? That's not good to have. So you will use these long things to add a base layer. Usually you don't have to understand this at all. Usually you can copy this from other project or some map service providers, right? They already have these ready. So you don't have to like write this from scratch. So yeah, this is pretty much it, right? So this is pretty much the working web maps. This is like the most simplest, web map ever, but it is actually working, right? So next we want to do is want to see a demos, right? We want to see how to do that. So to do that, I actually get, I have a demo folders in my GitHub. If you know GitHub is the like the place to host all the codes, right? So that's right. We can talk more about the GitHub later, right? So just so you know that we have a folder here that include the HTML, like here's, and we have a main.js. Let me see the chat is happening. What is chat is happening? All right.
I think we have one question about, I think, how to use .onion size from Angel, but no more questions. Maybe we could do that in the Q&A if you prefer.
Okay. Okay, so we can actually talk about this later when we want to host our website, but yeah. But anyway, we can just review what we just see, right? Because I spend a lot of time talking, and that's the most boring thing ever. I just want to show how to do that, right? In actions, right? Okay, so we see we have a index.htmls, we have a main.js, we have a styles.css. So practically all of these empties. I'm going to reproduce what we see here in the lecture so that we can start and add like each components we see, right? All right, so as you can see, I have, so this is like it's the same folders I have here, right? This is actually the same folders, right? So so let's first go to index because index.html is always the foundations, right? So yeah, by the way, for the question that you want to ask for these slides, yes, you can have that. It is in the same place, but it's the doc here in the presentation Vizathon, right? I can send out a link later. So so yeah. So first, I already write a lot of things in the head part. And again, you don't actually like write this part every time from the scratch because first, it's not necessary. And second, it's not very efficient, isn't it? So a lot of times we just reuse our former project or you copy from somewhere else if you can actually get that, if you get the permissions, right? Usually for the sake of open source, most of the project you see on the GitHub and all the other things can usually let you to copy their codes in many cases. So here's, let's see this by ourselves. A lot of these are actually like the description and metadata, right? Like the titles. We can actually go to this page. You can see this is already can be opened up in the Firefox, right? I like Firefox because it's like don't actually. I would say it's more secure, right? In many senses. So we open that. Now see nothing happens, right? Because now let's go back to the source code. We can notice that there is nothing in the bodies, right? That's why it's empty. So that's very normal. But however, we out in our head part, we already have a lot of like things like, for example, like these two are for leaflets, right? Notice that leaflet.css, leaflet.js, these are like the libraries you want to add to the JS environments, right? And also here's you have the jQueries here, right? Is misaligned. Yeah, this is better. Right, so basically you have this metadata plus libraries, right? So next we are going to do is that we want to actually write some things, right? If you want to reproduce this process, I recommend to go to, so this is my GitHub. You can go to the same web page I sent out in the chat. There was like a full list of these, instructions here you can reproduce, right? So here's first that we want to do is we want to actually populate the body section and add the components, right? Components of web map IDs. Remember in the lectures we talked about that we want to add the leaflet maps into HTML elements called ID equals map IDs, right? So this is actually things we want to add to the HTML before we go into the leaflet parts. Let's copy that and see here I have ID equals map ID, which is the ID so that we can add the leaflet components later, right? And also we also want to remember we need to add the main.js and the style.css into the HTML so that it can recognize it, okay? I usually like to incorporate into the last part of this HTML because you can always guarantee that every other libraries is before this main.js, right? That's right. So in that sense, you don't have to actually have to like you don't have to add a library inside this head section. You can actually add even outside the body section, I think. Let's try that and see what. Well, let's try this later. Okay, let's just stay with this for now. So right now we basically connected, although our files are still empty, right? That's all right. So this is the all for the index for our like a simple web maps, right? So next we want to set up the JavaScript code. So to do that, the same logics, right? Remember in the lectures we have in the leaflet we want to first add a web map object, which is here. As you can see, basically you're telling leaflet create a map on the HTML elements called map IDs and set a view to this place with this value, with this zoom levels, right? Can copy that and let's see that. And yeah, and save that. This is pretty much a working like a web maps environment. So let's go to see that and what it looks like, right? So right now it's empty. That's because you need to refresh every time to make some change, right? Let's refresh that. So yeah, this is pretty much it, right? Although there's nothing here, so you can see there were some buttons here. You can zoom in, zoom out. That's all right. We can always add something later so that we can see there was actually something here, right? So next we want to do is that we want to add the base layers, right? Remember the base layer is like here's, right? What we have here is this long base layer you can find out from the map providers or base layer providers, right? So I will copy this and copy here, right? By the way, there is really no shame of copying something as long as you have a permissions, right? I always like to say this is that copying is really the best things ever to happen to anyone, especially for programmers. Then now imagine this, right? In the 1990s, everything you need to like manually input. How many mistakes you will ever make, right? And right now we can actually copy that. And you're telling me that copying is such a cheesy way to achieve like the same goals? No, honestly, no. You can always help yourself and find the most comfortable way. Many times are copyings, right? And okay, so let's open that and see now still nothing, right? And that's why you need to refresh that and see. There it is. This is pretty much like a working like web map. Although there is nothing on it, but still you can like zoom in, zoom out, or use these buttons to click in, click out. This is pretty much a working like web map you can see and enjoy, right? I can do this all day long, right? I can look into this and pretty interesting, right? But a lot of times for practical use, we want to do something else. Is that we want to add the symbology that's actually like we want, right? Because right now there's nothing here, is nothing especially and nothing to interact with, right? So that's why we are going to add the same like here's, right? Like here's. So we want to add a circle on this map so that, and also to bind a pop-up on that symbologies so that we can achieve some degree of interactivities and I know add something data from ourselves, right? Because right now this base data does not have anything that's not ours. Right, so we want to add some basic symbologies. So let's just add first add some markers, right? Marker is another entities in the leaflet that you will see that later. Okay, let's refresh that. So this is pretty much like the locations of the certain place. So this is very, very common to see in Leaflet because this is like the default symbologies, right? Of course, you can change the colors, you can change even change the picture of that, right? And this is like the pop-up. This is a pop-up I'm talking about. So you can close that and you can open that by clicking that again. So this is like a default behavior of the pop-ups, right? All right. And also, again, let's look at these grammars together, right? So it followed the exactly same logic here. So markers only need one parameter, which is the location of that. So that's why we see here is the location of these markers. And this is pretty much it, right? And you need to manually add that into the my map, which is the map app components to let it show. We can actually try this, right? Let's just say, I don't want to add that, right? I just comment it out, which means it's not actually included in the environments, right? Let's save that and see what happens, right? All right, there is nothing happened because you have not add to the my maps yet. So this is very important, is that every time you define some things, you need to add that to my map and also followed by the other operations you want to do, right? So right, let's just followed by the circle and polygons, right? These are two very typical like a symbology or these are actually like features, right? So I will explain what is the difference between symbology and features, right? Let's copy that. And here, this is the first one. We have the circles. It is pretty much like the same as we show in the PowerPoints here, right? This is actually the same. So the polygons though are only have one parameters. So basically that's like the location of parameters because we have 1, 2, 3 points. So that's actually it should be a triangles. Let's see them and try in the web browsers, right? Refresh that, right? It will look like this, right? And because we have it's 1, 2, 3, 3 points, we have a triangles, right? And here is an example between these two entities, which is this is a marker, this is the like a features, right? For the marker, if you zoom in, you'll find out this like size will not change at all. So it will always stay the same, right? But for the feature, although this looks like the same, but if you zoom in, it will actually, you'll find out this is actually an actual circle that's actually on the place, right? So this is like in the actual size of the same of the real life. So it's not actually an abstract thing. It is actually theirs, right? The same with this large triangle, which is much more easier to understand. All right. So yeah, so this is pretty much like the basic symbology you want to have. Of course, there is more advanced version like GeoJSONs, also all source data you can use to populate a lot of others. But because of the times of these time restrict, I won't actually cover that. But however, I already include that part into as the extra contents. You can always try it out, but it's not that easy. It's not that hard, honestly. You can just try it out. I already have the codes. All you need to do is copy this part into your like a JS code and try it by yourselves, right? Right. So let's go back to the lectures and finish what's left. Right. So we already, as you can see, we already have like a working map. Although it is pretty simple and I would say not actually very informative, but still that is working examples, right? Can you have the pop-up lead to another link? Yes, you can. Now let's go see that. Since you ask, now notice that this is actually HTML contents inside the pop-up. So for example, I can actually write this. Is that I can change it to A and ref equals google.com. Yeah, I don't want to use the double quote. Google.coms, and this is pretty much like the like a link. I can show this in the, let's refresh that. Now here you notice that it's actually working, right? If we click on that, it will actually, okay. Yeah, so maybe you want to add the HTTP, yeah. HTTPS, yeah, should be working. Okay, so let's refresh it again and click on that. There it is. So yeah, this is, you can actually do everything inside the pop-up because it essentially is HTML elements, right? Right, so let's go back to the lectures, right? So since you have a working example, here's, if you want to go in online, how about that? Because actually what we're seeing right now in here is like a local version. Notice that it is actually inside my computers, right? Like the iOS, you like all these locations are inside my hard drive. You cannot see that from your sides, right? So how to go online, right? So first you can, of course, if you have money or you have like energies, you can borrow or buy a servers, right? That's practically like the best solution you can have, right? But in the world that where most of us don't have that like economic powers, a server is usually overkill, especially, and also sometimes you don't actually need to do that because although it can support like the backends, I won't actually go deep into that, but you can imagine this the more advanced the functionalities and the database and a lot of things. But a lot of times we don't actually need that for simple like websites, right? So that's why we go to the GitHub pages, which is the another service that you can use it to support simple websites. It is free and persistent. That is very important. So what is a GitHub anyways, right? The GitHub is a version control, a Git is a version control software. It will record your every committed changes. And GitHub is a website that can record your commit changes to online server and host the static web pages based on the changes inside your GitHub repositories. So, so how to do that, right? Of course, I believe a lot of you already like heard about what is a GitHub, but if you have not, if you don't have the GitHub account, you can create one. It's free, and usually you can. I think they open up the discount for educations, so that you can just apply for the education discount. It will be completely free. So I think I also use that. Anyway, you can either create the same repository with the same name, or you can fork my repo, which is the ones where I send out in the link. You can go to your GitHub repository page and go to the setting page to open up. I can show this right now. So first, there was one very useful software here is called the GitHub Desktop. So basically, this is like everything is happening here, right? So whenever you notice that this is actually the new things we type in inside our IDE, which is the VS Codes, right? So this is like a notepad that we type in the contents by ourselves. Now remember, this is all the exactly same contents here, right? So as we make changes to our files, our codes, these software will record that, and then after we feel like, okay, this is pretty much it, and we can call it a days. You can type in here as a summaries of your changes you do to the files, right? So that you can have a sense of what's your a history of the here's I have a history of the changes I do to these projects, right? For example, here first I do nothing. Basically, I just initial commit, I'll update my PPT, I copy README and update the PPT, and then add empty lab materials here. So as you can see, this is very common to have because you can actually see what you do and when did you do, which file did you do to this project, and that is very good to have. And another good thing is that you can actually see these on one of the web pages. Is that there's so many things. Which one of these are? Yeah, this one. All right. So you can actually open up in the. Okay, never mind. I can just open up in the. Yeah. So this is actually the same. So this instruction is inside these. It is a as you can see here, the name is the same, right? It's in the same GitHub repos, right? So what we want to do is that we want to open up the functions so that we can actually see and visit these contents stored inside this repo directly from the internet. So that's why we achieve these sharings, right? So imagine this is like a warehouse, right? So we store everything inside this warehouse. And what we are going to do is we open up a window of this warehouse so that everybody can see what's inside from the internet of that, right? Although we can also visit in the GitHub, and here we can also download that and download everybody's local machines and open up in your a local version. But that is so troublesome, right? So right now, and again, another best part about this function is that once you open up the window of a warehouse, you can always update your websites like real times, right? Whenever you make some changes in the local and then push it to the cloud, which is a warehouse, that everybody can see the changes you made, right? Sometimes that's not desirable because that's kind of like a fishes, right? That's does not sound secure at all. But a lot of times, since we want to share our projects and we want to share our work, that is very good to have. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So to open that, we want to go to the settings, and we want to go to the pages. Now here's, notice that it will ask you like a source. The source is something that like the source of Windows, right? You want to put your source, put your files, you want to show to the person, show to the outside walls in front, like just the next to the window so that everybody can see that, right? So that's why we're going to select these nones and choose the mains. So basically that's like the only branch we have, right? And that's pretty much it. We can click on save. And right now it says that your site is ready to be published at these websites, right? You can remember that, or you can just visit that by just to remember that, right? I don't know how to like find this later. I think you can actually find this later when you revisit this part. But anyway, let's wait for several minutes and let's go back to our lectures to finish that, okay? So after we open these functions, we can now access by your names, which is your GitHub usernames, plus the github.io, plus your repos names, and then the path to your HTML files, right? So to save your changes on the online maps with the GitHub desktops, the first thing you need to do is commits, right? Let's go do this, follow this logic again, right? Let's go to our GitHub desktop, and this is like it's exactly same thing what I'm talking about, right? Now we have made some changes here. So now I need to commit to the main, which is the branch I have. And actually, I need to understand what is a branch is. You can imagine like they have a different version of a different repos, right? So what I do to do now is that I will go into records my current changes, which is here. So as we see, this is just the changes we just made, right? Let's say demo is ready. Right. So this usually you can write something that's more informative, or you can write the more description like here's like this is from workshops in Vizathon. And this is actually kind of important because you want to be specific and you want to be like, remind yourself, your future you to, to remember what you're doing, right? This is actually surprisingly important, right? Right, after you enter the titles, actually, you only need the title. You can commit to the mains, right? And here's the changes are basically not just empties, right? So that means that our as you open this history, this is part of the history right now, right? So now we want to do is that we want to click this push origins, which means we push this history to the official repos to make it officials, right? To push to the clouds and to make it to the warehouse, right? Our warehouse in the cloud. So now here you notice that it is there, right? Just now. Right. So this is actually part of an archive or warehouse right now. So right now, whenever, just to give it several minutes because it's not like instantly happening. So whenever you go to these like web pages, you can just visit that web pages you just make, and also whenever you have some changes, it will automatically be updated. Again, do remember that it is not like instantly. You can wait for 7 minutes for it happens, right? Notice that I have the this is not like the web page I made, but this is like the same things I here's the same readme I have here, right? These are the same things. That means that it is actually working, right? So let's go to the demo because I store everything inside the demos, right? So yeah, this is like
Mr. Liu, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but if there's not too much left, can we also plan?
Yeah, this is like the last part. So
minutes of Q&A.
Yeah,
we were thinking about 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no more. So yeah, this is, as you can see, this is pretty much the same as the one, especially like here, if we click on that, so we go to the Google, it's exactly what I made to the changes to the projects, right? But yeah, this is like how you make the changes. Of course, you can add more things later as you progress into your project. Like I can have more contents here, but we don't have the times. But after you make changes, you can always make sure that you, like here, I can just write some things randomly, and then it should be, yeah, after you save that, it should be popping up here. So you notice that, yeah, there's something randoms, right? And then you can just commit if it's actually indeed non-randoms, and push that. And after you push that, these web pages should be updated to their current status, which is very useful to have, and it's very easier and competent for the productions, right? Right. So that's pretty much it, I would say. This is pretty much it. And we have a more extra contents in this website. You can always find out like how to add a GeoJSON layers. I wish I can cover that, but honestly, we don't actually have times. So, so yeah, that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, I see some question popping up. Can you insert image on top of the map in the pop? Yes, you can. You can actually like either site or image of or store your image inside somewhere in your repos. For example, you can have another folders here is called or inside this folder that called like pictures. Then you can cite that inside this pop-up, right? I can figure out the internet is like the only, it's pretty much everywhere, right? Yeah, there was a lot of good answers. Any other question? What's your favorite thing you have done utilizing code? Are talking about the VS Code or this code or? Hello?
You're audible, Mr. Lee. Please go on.
I think it's referring to the codes, right? So like in relation to today's code. Okay, my favorite thing. Oh, I mistakenly opened up Tor. Anyway, I think a bad thing is interactivity, because I think the best part of the web map is interactivities, right? So in that sense, it definitely has to be the this pop-up, because it gives a sense of controls, right? Whenever a user give up, go to this website, and whenever they click in, like there and there's, you can always say, okay, this is happening. I can actually make some very interesting findings by myself. And that is, although everything is everything is designed by you, but still that is very nice to have, because it really give you like a new fresh feelings, right? What's your favorite programming languages? Really, no, I don't actually have one. I wish someday we don't actually program. I wish someday we just tell AI and let it do ourselves. And honestly, this is really like physically like demanding jobs, and that's nobody would like it, honestly. Especially when you're doing some like front end works. That's honestly, I although I don't want to be like a discouraging, but there is actually a lot of things. Of course, in the first few years, it will feel like, okay, this is good, this is interesting. But imagine doing this for 20 years. That's definitely like the experience, isn't it? So yeah. Yeah, sorry, I really shouldn't have said that, because I really don't want to like discourage you into that, because this is, I think I'm talking about something inside the industry, not academia per se, because if of course there was some position in the industry that also requires to do innovative things, but what I'm talking about is that, especially for those positions where you need to like spend hours like proceed a certain div, that's not fun at all. So I think that, yeah, and also that is another issue, is that there's really need a new, like I know that a lot of person already did this, is that is to generally reduce the workload of front end work. And I think Bootstraps and a lot of like existing libraries doing a great work on that, but still programming is hard, and that is very challenging work. And I don't think there was really a nice way to address this, just like a like everyday lives, right? It's actually like very hard jobs to do, and that's why a lot of people are into this, because it's challenging, is satisfying in some ways, right? Right.
If there are any more questions, please post them to the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself.
All right. Do you know RStudio well? RStudio, yes, I use that when I was writing certain papers, but I honestly, I don't love R in general. I think Python is much more, I would say, clean in some ways, because this is more consistent, but R is like everybody's contributing, which is a good thing, but everybody is using a different language, and this is really like a messy, like a documentations and messy like grammars. Everybody's using different formats, but yeah, but R is working. If it's working, it's worth it. Okay. And which programming language do you most recommend? Yeah, basically Python's, right? Python and Node.js. That's probably better in terms of what you're referring to as the programming languages, right? Programming languages can be very specific or can be very generous, depends on what the scenario you're talking about, right? But yeah, I basically use Python. I do a lot of jobs in Python, and I used to use MATLAB, but that's like 4 years ago. But I do a lot of work in JS, and the JS I think is very flexible, as I discussed in the lectures. That is very newcomer friendly, and even if you make 1,000 mistake, it doesn't care. So yeah, that's definitely a good thing to have. How long have you used Python? Maybe 5-6 years. When I was in my undergraduate programs, I learned Python. So that's really good things, right? Yeah, Python is really like I would say a very standardized programming languages, and yeah, you should learn that. It's not very hard. I mean, there's tons of tutorials online. So yeah. How would you recommend to learn it? I don't know. Maybe some you can just play by yourselves, right? I mean, to learn a certain language is really just I think it's a threshold. When you reach that threshold where you can learn by yourself, I think that's basically don't feel like I have to read some things to learn that. Basically, just to go into that and try by yourself, or just to go to the documentation to read by yourself, and you don't actually need to go for the certain videos to do that. But for newcomers, of course, you can go to the tons of tutorials, videos, and things, right? When it comes to creating interactive and non-interactive visualization, would you say that Python is more flexible, or in the company? I think there was a professor in I don't know his affiliation, but his name is Wu Qiusheng. He's kind of developing the whole platforms based on Pythons. So you can figure out. I think I have this contact. But anyway, for Python, is not usually be viewed as the visualization languages per se, because Python is more of like easily used as a backends, which is like they deal with a lot of like data and processings. But in terms like mappings, especially for maps, is not actually very active like before. But right now we have a lot of efforts into making Python more, I would say, more mapping friendly, right? That's the words I'm thinking about. Yeah. And do you any tips on debuggings, right? I don't. I'm still learning about debugging. It's really I think VS Code is working for Pythons, right? And also, if you don't actually need a lot of work, if especially for the small size work, you can just pump in a lot of like console.log or print to see what's inside, right? I'm curious how deep web the onions side work in SAP. I don't know, honestly, don't know. The deep web I try to stay away from that, but yeah, I think you can just first you need. I think it is pretty much the same as the ones that you general, but they just use a different protocol. But anyway, I honestly don't know. So if you are curious, you can just look up in the internet. I guess a response of like a YouTube, YouTube featuring this topic. Anyway.
Well, I think we're slightly over time. So for those who are running late, I'd like to thank Mr. Liu for this wonderful workshop. There was a lot that I learned myself. So thank you so much for sharing so much with us. And just a quick reminder for those who are leaving, our next workshop is